Mountain Man hired a pregnant widow to cook, but found a woman who taught him grace. The wind whispered through the tall pines of the Montana wilderness, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke, snow, and solitude. Caleb Turner leaned against the rough-hewn doorframe of his log cabin, his broad shoulders framed against the early morning light. He had lived in these mountains for nearly a decade now, far away from the bustling towns and the gossiping crowds. People called him the Mountain Man, half out of respect, half out of fear. He didn't mind the name. He had chosen this life, chopping his own wood, hunting his own meat, fishing the streams, and carving out a living from the land. It kept him strong, and more importantly, it kept his heart from aching too much over the life he'd lost long ago. But even mountain men needed help sometimes. The truth was, Caleb could hunt a deer blindfolded, build a cabin with his bare hands, and survive 3 weeks on nothing but beans and snowmelt, but he couldn't cook to save his life. His meals were bland, burnt, or both. And though he'd never admit it to another soul, he was tired of eating the same scorched bread and overcooked venison day after day. That was why, against his nature, Caleb had gone into town last month and posted a notice at the Mercantile. Wanted, cook, room and board provided, fair wages, remote mountain cabin. Most laughed at the very idea. Who in their right mind would live in the wilderness just to cook for a reclusive mountain man? But one woman had answered, and now she was on her way up the trail, riding in a wagon that the storekeeper's boy had guided halfway to his land. Caleb's sharp eyes followed the rickety wagon as it approached. He expected some stout, no-nonsense woman in her middle years, maybe widowed, maybe desperate enough to trade the comfort of town for his lonely mountain. He just needed someone who could cook, not someone to fuss over him. But when the wagon stopped and she stepped down, Caleb's breath caught. She wasn't what he expected. The woman was young, no older than 25. Her dark hair was braided neatly under a shawl, her pale face tired but striking in the cold light. And she was pregnant. Her swollen belly showed beneath her plain dress, marking her as a woman carrying a heavy burden. She met his eyes, and for a moment Caleb felt as though the whole mountain had gone silent. "I'm Clara," she said softly, her voice steady though her hands clutched the shawl tight around her. "I'm here about the cooking position." Caleb blinked, dragging himself back to his senses. "You're the one who answered the notice." "Yes," she said, lifting her chin. "I can cook. I can keep a home. And I need a place to stay." He hesitated, scanning her from head to toe. A pregnant widow in his cabin? That wasn't what he signed up for. He needed someone sturdy, someone who could work without fuss. A woman carrying a child. That was complication. That was risk. "You're with child," Caleb said bluntly. Clara didn't flinch. "Yes." "My husband. He died in a logging accident last winter. I have no family left. The baby will be here in a few months, and I need somewhere safe. Somewhere I can earn my keep." Her words hung in the crisp mountain air. Caleb's instincts told him to turn her away. A lone woman with a babe would bring nothing but noise, worry, and weakness into his carefully built solitude. But another part of him, the part that remembered what it was to be human, to be kind, couldn't ignore the quiet strength in her voice. "Can you really cook?" he asked gruffly. A small smile touched her lips. "Better than you, I'd wager." For the first time in years, Caleb almost smiled back. Inside the cabin, Clara set to work at once. The place was neat enough. Caleb wasn't a slob, but it lacked a woman's touch. The shelves were bare, the table plain, the hearth unused except for burning logs. "You have flour, beans, some dried meat," she noted as she examined the shelves. "But you've been wasting food. See here. The flour's clumped from dampness. You need better storage." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You're not afraid to tell me what I've been doing wrong?" She glanced back at him with a flicker of fire in her eyes. "If I'm to cook for you, I'll do it properly. No use pretending otherwise. That spark. Caleb hadn't seen it in a long time. Most people in town lowered their voices around him, muttered about his temper, or avoided him altogether. But this woman, carrying another life inside her, spoke to him as if he were just a man. And strangely, he liked it. By evening, the cabin was filled with a smell Caleb hadn't known in years: warm bread, simmering stew, and something almost like home. Clara moved with quiet determination, stirring the pot, tasting, seasoning, as though the small cabin kitchen were a grand hall. When she finally set the food before him, Caleb ate in silence. The bread was soft, the stew rich and hearty. Every bite was a reminder of how long he'd gone without comfort. He looked up to find Clara watching him, her hands folded in her lap. "Well?" she asked. He cleared his throat. "It's good." Her lips curved, just slightly. "Good enough to keep me here?" Caleb leaned back, studying her once more. He saw the weariness in her eyes, the weight of grief she carried, and yet beneath it all was a resilience that even the mountain could respect. "You can stay," he said at last. "As long as you want." Clara let out a breath she'd been holding, and for the first time since stepping down from the wagon, she looked truly relieved. That night, long after Clara had retired to the small corner room he'd cleared for her, Caleb sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He'd hired a cook, but what he'd brought into his cabin was something more. A woman who had lost much, yet still stood strong. A woman carrying new life into a world that had only shown her hardship. Caleb didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in years, he wondered if Grace, that fragile human gift he thought long buried, had found its way back into his life through Clara. And he wasn't sure whether to be grateful or afraid. Winter came down from the mountains like a silent wolf. Snow drifted against the cabin walls, the wind howled through the pines, and the creek froze into a glassy ribbon. For Caleb, these were the months he lived for, the wilderness at its harshest, when only the strong endured. But this winter was different. Inside the cabin, Clara's presence softened everything. The fire always burned steady, the shelves were neatly stocked, and meals no longer felt like punishment. She filled the silence with quiet humming as she worked, and at night, when Caleb thought she slept, he often heard her whispering prayers for her unborn child. At first, Caleb kept his distance. He was a man of few words, content to let her cook and keep house while he chopped wood, hunted game, and repaired the cabin. But little by little, Clara's calm strength drew him in. One evening, after a long day cutting logs, Caleb returned to find her struggling to lift a pot from the hearth. Her swollen belly made her awkward, and the pot nearly slipped. Instinctively, he rushed forward, steadying it with one hand. "You shouldn't be lifting this," he said gruffly. She shot him a look, breathless but firm. "I'm pregnant, not broken. I can still do my part." Caleb stared at her for a long moment before nodding. "Reckon you're tougher than half the men I've known." A faint blush touched her cheeks, and something unspoken passed between them. Days turned into weeks. Clara began teaching Caleb things he'd never cared to learn: the proper way to season food, how to mend shirts instead of tossing them aside, even how to sit at a table and eat like a man with manners. "You shovel food in like a bear," she teased one night as he devoured her roast rabbit. "And a bear eats well enough to live," he replied with a smirk. "Still," she said softly, "there's grace in slowing down, in appreciating what's before you." Grace. The word lingered with him. It wasn't one Caleb used often, not for himself, not for anyone. Yet every day Clara seemed to bring a little more of it into his cabin, into his life. Then came the night when the baby arrived. The storm outside was fierce, snow hammering against the windows, the wind shrieking like a banshee. Clara's cries cut through the roar, sharp and urgent. Caleb had never felt so helpless in his life. "I'll get the doctor," he said, reaching for his coat. "There's no time," Clara gasped, gripping his arm. "It has to be now." Panic surged through him, but Clara's eyes, fierce and steady even in pain, pulled him back. "You can do this," she whispered. Caleb had faced bears, wolves, and blizzards, but nothing had ever shaken him like holding Clara's hand through those long, agonizing hours. He boiled water, tore sheets into cloths, did everything she told him, his rough hands trembling all the while. And then, at last, a cry filled the cabin, the cry of new life. Caleb stared in awe at the tiny, wrinkled child in his hands, his heart pounding. Clara, exhausted and pale, reached out. "My son," she whispered. Caleb placed the baby in her arms, his chest aching with something he hadn't felt in years. "Oh, fear, hope." "You did well," Clara breathed, her eyes shining with tears. "Better than I ever expected." Caleb sat beside her, silent, watching as the newborn rooted against her. For a long while, neither spoke, the storm raging outside while inside the cabin there was only warmth, only life. In the weeks that followed, the cabin changed again. Clara's baby, Samuel, she named him, filled the air with tiny cries and soft coos. Caleb, once the loneliest man in the mountains, now found himself rising at night to stoke the fire, to fetch water, to rock the child when Clara needed rest. It wasn't his child, but he couldn't help feeling a fierce protectiveness, as though the boy were blood of his blood. One evening, Clara looked up from nursing the baby and caught Caleb watching. "You don't have to help so much," she said gently. Caleb shook his head. "Don't rightly feel like I have a choice. That little one's part of this cabin now. Part of us." Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she reached across the table and touched his hand. "You've given us more than a roof. You've given us safety. And kindness, even if you don't admit it." He swallowed hard, unused to such words. "You gave me something too," he said quietly. "Grace. I didn't even know I was missing it until you showed up." For a moment, silence stretched between them, not the heavy silence of solitude, but a gentle one, filled with possibility. Spring came, melting the snow and greening the mountainsides. Caleb took Clara and Samuel outside, showing them the land he called home, the creek swollen with meltwater, the meadow bursting with wildflowers, the distant peaks still capped in white. "It's beautiful," Clara whispered, holding the baby close. "A man can lose himself out here," Caleb said. Then, after a pause, he added, "Or he can find himself." She looked at him, her dark eyes full of something he hadn't dared hope for. "And which have you done?" Caleb drew a long breath. "I reckon I found more than I ever thought I would." "You, him." "A family, if you'll have me." Clara's lips parted, her eyes glistening. "Are you asking me, Caleb Turner?" He shifted awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I ain't good with words. But I know this. I don't want to face another winter without you. Either of you." Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Caleb. I'll have you." That night, under a sky blazing with stars, Caleb held Clara close, Samuel sleeping between them. For the first time in years, the mountain man didn't feel alone. He had hired a widow to cook for him, but he had found a woman who taught him grace, love, and the meaning of home. And in the heart of the wilderness, that was the greatest gift of all.